Today we're going to look at the Spanish-American War. This occurred in 1898. It was between the Spanish and the United States. And you can kind of see, looking at this cartoon here, the kind of the stages the United States has gone through to get where it was. You go from a baby and get all the way up here. This kind of reminds you of those robber barons, but this is a result, the big fat cat, I guess you could say, of the Spanish-American War. This is what makes us into a world power. It gets started with Cuba. Cuba is a colony of Spain, and they're not happy about it. A lot of atrocities going on there, and the United States is reading about it in the papers, and they're sympathetic. We were once a colony. We wanted our independence, and we fought for our independence. And we feel a lot of sympathy toward Cuba. Cuba is in need of our help. And there's not really many other different ways. There's not many ways of looking at it like that. We are just going to be sympathetic. That is not to say that there are not other ulterior motives. Go back to our reasons for expansion and look at Mahan. He would love to have Cuba, particularly Guantanamo Bay, as a refueling station. But anyway, the Spanish were not really willing to let the Cubans go. And so they're going to send a General Valeriano Weyler, whose nickname was the Butcher, to Cuba to kind of, take care of the situation. And the atrocities that he committed are going to be reported, particularly in two competing newspapers, the Journal and the World. Now, I'm going to say this, that both of those newspapers used a tactic called yellow journalism, and the stories that were in there were very much similar to what you might think of for a tabloid. They were exaggerated stories. Some were just flat out made up, but their purpose wasn't so much because they cared about the Cubans. Really, their purpose was to sell as many newspapers as possible. And so this was just for a big circulation war between these two newspapers. It does have some results, of course. This is General Weyler. And one of the things that he's going to do is he's going to round those Cubans up who are creating problems, and he's going to put them in concentration camps. Concentration camps are not created or invented by the Germans in World War II. They had existed many times in the past. And concentration camps tend to be inhumane. They usually do not have sanitation or not good sanitation. And anytime you have a lack of sanitation, you have disease run rampant. In addition to that, they were not fed well. But between the feeding and then the disease, it is going to create a crisis. And that crisis, of course, it's going to anger a lot of Americans and want to see Weyler and the Spanish out of Cuba. You have some in the United States calling for war, although the government is hesitant to kind of enter into a war over this reason. We haven't really been attacked yet. But things begin to change in February of 1898, and that is when the USS Maine is sunk in a Cuban harbor. And the newspapers are immediately going to begin to blame the Spanish. And in this one, they don't necessarily say the Spanish, but they do say an enemy. And of course, if it happens in a Cuban harbor, that would be the Spanish. It says it was not an accident. So there's a $50,000 reward being offered. But again, you can kind of look at the headline there and get the idea that yellow journalism was at play here. Same thing here. That was the Journal. This is the World. And look at it. Talking about circulation. They're very aware of how many papers they sell, and they're letting everybody know that, well, this is a point. It's up there on its headline. So yeah, how many they sell is important. Same thing's going on here. looking for an inquiry. You can see the accident was made possible by an enemy. Look at the picture itself, not a photograph. They didn't know it was going to explode, so nobody was there ready to take a picture. But look at how this even was sensationalized. You got little men flying up through the air. You know, and you can see the death and destruction of this great ship, and that it was done on purpose. Again, it's gonna be, it's not immediately we're gonna declare war yet. That's gonna happen because of the Delaunay letter, in which the Spanish ambassador is going to insult McKinley. He called him a weak and biddable fool. Said he had the, and listen, McKinley was seen as weak, at least internationally, and a lot of people in the United States were not really, didn't really like him that much. Even Theodore Roosevelt said he had the back of a chocolate eclair, the backbone of a chocolate eclair. So not a lot of feelings of greatness toward McKinley. But regardless, because of the Delaunay letter, we do end up declaring war. And we're going to fight this war really quick. It's going to take about 3 months. We weren't really ready for a war. Our army is going to fight in the tropics in wool uniforms. More people die of disease. More Americans die of disease than actual fighting in this war. But we can kind of break this up into 2 big points. One is Commodore Dewey is going to sail to Manila Harbor, and that's in the Philippines, all the way around the world. We're talking over there in Asia, Southeast Asia, so it was all the way around the world. And this is a surprise move. We have basically stated that our interest is Cuba, and yet we show up to fight the Spanish in the Philippines. And they are surprised, and we are going to destroy the Spanish fleet there. Now, this is one reason, too, why Admiral Mahan said we needed a modern fleet not made up of wooden ships, because the Spanish still had wooden ships. They were considered a world power, and we're getting ready to take care of that because we're going to destroy their fleet, burn them down to the water. Really easy, since they have those old, slow wooden ships. Closer to home, you get Theodore Roosevelt, who is going to charge up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, leading the Rough Riders. And really, this is probably the most famous incident of the war, and makes Teddy Roosevelt famous. Okay, this is, of course, before he's president. This is where he kind of gains his fame. But regardless, the Spanish are going to end up surrendering, mostly because we've destroyed their fleet. And to end the war, we have the Treaty of Paris of 1898. Okay, now a few things. We were fighting, ostensibly we were fighting for Cuba's independence. So before we went to war, it was stated that we could not we could not annex Cuba, and that's the Teller Amendment. We were fighting for their independence. We're not going to take this as a territory. But even though we can't take Cuba for a territory, and we don't gain it, we do install a U.S. military government there for 3 years to protect our business interests, okay? Also, as a part of the Treaty of Paris of 1898, the Platt Amendment is added, and that's going to put limits on what the Cuban government could do. We gain 2 naval bases in Cuba. One of those would be Guantanamo Bay, and also we essentially take the right of intervention. We have the right to intervene in this area if we believe it's necessary. So we don't own it. We don't kind of bring it into the United States, although we have a good bit of control over it. We do gain Puerto Rico as a territory, Guam as a territory, and also the Philippines. And the Philippines were probably the most controversial of these, because they had also been fighting for independence. Their freedom fighter over there was Emilio Aguinaldo, and he had been fighting the Spanish for a few years for independence. And here come the Americans, and I think in some ways they're pretty excited. Oh, they're going to help us defeat the Spanish, and then they do, and turn around and they're betrayed because Spain is going to sign the Philippines over to the United States. Now, the Philippines is going to divide Americans too. Some who support taking the Philippines and others who don't. But understand the Filipinos did not want to join the United States, and they're going to resist U.S. occupation for 2 years. And at the end of those 2, and y'all, by the way we treated the Filipinos was horrendous. It was not democratic. We did not extend constitutional rights to these areas. And matter of fact, there were some Supreme Court cases, the insular cases, in which they're going to sue. It's going to make its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to rule. They're going to decide that the Constitution does not follow the flag. So even though we control these areas, we do not have to guarantee them constitutional rights. And the way we treat them is, like I said, horrendous. Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the freedom fighter there, is actually going to be jailed for about 20 years. No real trial or anything like that. But it's seen as a crucial, it's seen as very important for protecting U.S. economic interests in Southeast Asia, okay? But at the same time, and this is what I was talking about, dividing America, you know, we're out here across the world. It's likely that this is going to cause future wars in the Pacific. So they're kind of divided, and that's the imperialist and the anti-imperialist. And you can look at number 3 right here. It says that they opposed expansion. Carnegie was a part of that, Mark Twain, people like that. But you have the others like Theodore Roosevelt who do support expansion, okay? And number 2 here is, I've already talked about it earlier, talking about yellow journalism, its importance, but also the Delaunay letter. All right, and that's it for today.